If you are a fan of discussing the books that you read in the last year and you really want to know what kind of books I read and above all what my top 10 books were that I read this last year, then today's video just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing the year 2024 in books. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we are taking a look at my reading in the year 2024, as well as a little bit about my journey in making this YouTube channel. I know, like a lot of you, I saw a lot of end of the year lists, which I have my own to provide. A lot of that came out in December, some of it like at the beginning of December. I'm a strong believer in letting the year finish before I give you a list, because I was reading books clear up until the end of 2024. And so I would certainly like to account for all of that in this video. In the 6 months since I started this channel, I've done over 120 videos. That being said, I actually still read way more books than that, and I have not been able to make a video on all those books, but I have certainly enjoyed making the videos for these books. And as I was going through and trying to give a ranking of my top 10 books from the year, most of them were books that I read in the second half of the year. And I think the fact that I made videos on them was one of the things that helped to put them into my top 10 lists. Before I get to my top 10 lists, let's talk a little bit about how much I read this year. I know that I made a video earlier in this year that talked about reading a lot of books in one year. There was some criticism of that video because I will admit that reading too many books in a year can certainly diminish how much you're getting from each book, and I certainly know there's a lot of questions about how I can read so many books. So let me add a little bit of clarity and some caveats as to how I can read so many books before I give you my final number, because it was much bigger than I expected. First of all, I do listen to a lot of books. I read and listen, but just because the way my life is with a toddler at home, I do a lot of listening. And yes, I do listen at more than one speed, usually somewhere between 2 and 2.5 speed, which means I do get through books quicker. And that also does mean that I'm dependent on audiobooks. I do still read physical books. And one of the reasons I read so many books this year was in part because I finished my dissertation, which meant reading a lot of books for my topic. But I finished that in the first half of the year, and so I actually did not do too many videos on that. Although in the coming year, I hope to have a few videos that are still relevant to my personal area of interest, because I am still trying to read up on it, and I do think that you'll probably see some of those reviews. There are also a few things that really prompt up my numbers. So for starters, I was subscribed to an app this year, the Bookshelf app for Deseret Books, which was an opportunity to read and listen to a whole lot of books that were very religious in nature, and a lot of them were a little shorter. I went back and I looked at it, and I think on average, each of those books that I read was somewhere between 120 and 130 pages. So that was one thing that really bolstered my numbers this year, especially since I was paying for that app. I made it a point of either reading 25 pages a day in that app or listening to an hour of it on double speed. And so that really bolstered my numbers in the total number of books. On top of that, I read or listened to all of Shakespeare's plays this year, which also added a large number to my totality. So these are a few of the things that just kind of bolstered my numbers more than I expected. So before I give you my total number, let me break down where some of those books came from this year so that you understand why it is the number that it is. That Bookshelf app that I talked about, I read 77 books this year in it. So more than one a week on average. There are 38 Shakespeare plays. So between those two of those, that was more than a third of all the books that I read this year. The #1 Ladies Detective Agency, a series that I found out about in 2023, I started reading it this last year. I enjoyed it so much that I decided that I was going to read the entirety of the series. So I read 2, sometimes even 3 of those books a month. It was easy to do. They're very easy reads. I loved reading them. In the year 2025, I hope to find another lengthy series that I can start from beginning to end, even if it has more than a dozen books. I've also mentioned before that I'd read all of the Pulitzer Prize finalists and winners. That's 18 books. That one's a little more challenging because not all of those books can have audiobooks. Sometimes I can't even find an ebook of them, or I can't even get a hard copy of them. Sometimes it can be a real challenge. And on top of that, I don't even get that list until about halfway through the year. I think they're announced in May, April or May, I forget which one, which only gives me a portion of the year to read all of those. I also am a big fan of the Discworld series, and so I read one of those a month, so I got 12 more of those. I usually pick an author every year that I want to read the entirety of their bibliography, especially if I've already read some of their books and I really enjoy them. There were two this year that I tackled, and that would be David Sedaris and Liane Moriarty. I really enjoy both of their works, and so I finished reading any of their books that I had not read in the past. I think I had about 12 David Sedaris books that I read this year, and maybe half a dozen to 7 or 8 of Liane Moriarty books. I'm not entirely sure. Also, I do read some young adult novels that can be very quick reads. I read the Wild Robot series, at least the first 3 that are out so far. I read one of my favorite series that I first read when I was a kid, or at least parts of it when I was a kid, the Louis Barnevelt novel series, which was written by John Bellairs. There's 12 books in that series. I think I read 11 of them. I also read Liane Moriarty's, her 3 books that are geared towards a much younger audience. So that also added probably another 18 to 20 books that were pretty short in their length. I mean, not quite picture books. Of course, if I included all the books that I read to my daughter at night, this would be a much, much longer list. That being said, I read this year, if my numbers are correct, which they may not be because it was a lot of books, I read 153 fiction books and 3 books of poetry. All 3 of those were for the Pulitzer Prizes. And I read 147 non-fiction books. A good deal of those coming from my bookshelf app, which means that my grand total for the year was 303 books. Yikes. I must say, looking at 2025, I do not intend to read anywhere near as many as that. And I certainly have questions about how I can even make videos for all of those. And I will make a separate video discussing what I hope to do in 2025 that's a little different, that can hopefully make videos for most of the books that I have read, as well as trying to do a few things different that I really hope to do in the coming year. That's a lot of books. I have certainly enjoyed reading all of them. That is by far the most that I've ever read in a year. Like I said, there are a few things that really bolstered that number that meant that I was reading and listening to books far more than I did in the past. And I can't say that I recommend that for most people. A matter of fact, I fell behind on doing my videos for the Shakespeare plays that I was reading, and I've decided going forward that I probably won't release those as I read them. I will probably take my time releasing Shakespeare's videos. They're always going to be good, and I may even read those plays again before I make a video for them, and I think those are not only some of the solutions for trying to get a video for all of them, but I think that should also give you some insight into the challenges of picking someone like Shakespeare and trying to read all of their plays. It can be very rewarding, but it can also mix together and can make it a bit of a challenge. And so for all those reasons, I would not recommend that you necessarily try to read 303 books. However, I do recommend that most people read more books. And that is something that I hope to address in the year 2025 as I look to how this channel can be beneficial to people. In addition to reviews, what are parts of the conversation that I would like to have? And that is something that I am certainly going to address in the coming year. Of course, I couldn't end this video without giving you my top 10 books that I read in the year 2024. There are a few issues with this that are worth noting. I didn't want to do just books that came out in 2024 because I read all the Pulitzer Prize books. That actually puts me about a year behind on most books. I also try to get a lot of suggestions. The podcast that I listen to, a lot of times they interview an author on a book, and that might lead me to a really good book, but usually that book is a year or 2 old at that point if it was getting the attention. And I just read a lot of different books. The premise of this channel is that Spencer reads everything. So for those reasons, I have decided to tell you my top 10 books that I've read this year. I have chosen to exclude certain books. I'm not going to include Shakespeare in that. I love Shakespeare, and he would always be in my top 10 list, at least certain books of his. Also, some of the books that I read this year, like my large series, like the #1 Ladies Detective Agency, I really enjoyed that series. It would be hard to really pull one of them out. And so instead what I've decided is just give the top 5 fiction and the top 5 nonfiction that I read this year, not in any particular order, but I did also try to give some diversity and explain why exactly I enjoyed that book and how it might be representative of a particular category. So without further ado, my top 10 books for this year, starting with the 5 fiction, would be, first on my list is The Wild Robot by Peter Brown. It came out in 2016. So far there are 3 books in this series. I've read the 3 that have come out. I believe more are coming out, and a movie just came out this year. I really, really enjoyed this series. It was not only one of my favorite books to read this year, but it's actually one of my favorite books geared toward a younger audience that I've read in a long time. It deals with a lot. I mean, it's a fun read. It's a funny read at times, but it also deals with a lot of questions of existence and family and what it means to be human. And just there's so much in this book that I really enjoyed, even though it's geared toward a younger audience. And so that's one of the reasons why it is at the top of my list. The next book on my list is Cormac McCarthy's The Road. This actually came out in 2006. This is a book I've heard a fair amount about, but the reason it came on my radar is because of the New York Times top 100 books of the 21st century, which I've talked a lot about on this channel, and I've explored some of the books on that list. This was one of them, and this was easily my favorite one that I read this last year. I also had some other friends that recommended it, and I really enjoyed this book. It is a challenging book. It is oddly a very bleak, but also a very optimistic book at times. I would say that it is one of those books that you come away with saying that there's really a lot of different approaches that an individual could take when it comes to interpreting this book or what you think you should get out of this book. And I really enjoyed that about this book. It's not a very long book, but I would certainly recommend this to anyone that is interested in Cormac McCarthy's works, or you want to dig into that list. I would certainly start with this book. It was one of the best books this year that I read. Next on my list is Big Little Lies by Liane Moriarty. I told you that I tried reading all of her books this year, at least the ones that I had yet to read. I loved the miniseries, and I have loved all of her books. And so when I got to this book, I was curious if all the hype from the miniseries or having seen the miniseries on HBO would ruin it for me, and it did not. This book absolutely delivered. I really enjoy Liane Moriarty's writing. I have not read a single one of her books that I came away with saying I didn't like, and I think that everything that she does well is on full display in this book. Additionally, sometimes in her books, her writing is so good that I'm not even sure I care much about the mystery. In this one, she does such a good job at making it a compelling mystery. She also does a really good job at dealing with really heavy and really painful elements of humanity and relationships and community, but she does all of it while telling a fascinating story, and I really enjoyed this book, and I really enjoyed the miniseries, and I just can't recommend Liane Moriarty enough, but if you are a follower of me, you already know that. My next comes from the Discworld series. I love the Discworld series, and I didn't know if I'd be able to pick just one book out, but as soon as I started looking at the 12 Discworld books that I read this year, it jumped out at me. This is probably my absolute favorite Discworld book so far. That is Small Gods. It came out in 1992. I think it is the maybe 13th book in the series or so. It is so good. I love it. I love so much of the Discworld humor, the world building. I think that there is this this impression that it is a parody, and so there's not necessarily much to take seriously, but that's not true at all. And I certainly think that the way that he is addressing the mythology and the creation of ideas and ideologies is just fantastic. It's not only funny, it is very thought-provoking. I love Small Gods. It is so far probably my favorite book in the whole series. It is certainly my favorite standalone book so far, and I just cannot recommend this enough if you are going to be into this type of humor, and if you think Discworld is for you, or if you're still waffling, this is a great book to give a read, and that is why it made it on my list. And sticking with fantasy, another great fantasy series that I started this year that I really enjoyed was the Powder Mage trilogy. I could put any of the books on there, but I just put the first book in the series, The Promise of Blood by Brian McClellan. That first came out in 2013. I think this trilogy finished like in 2017 or 18, and he has since written another trilogy that is in the same universe, and I look forward to reading that in the coming year. I really enjoyed Promise of Blood. I really enjoyed taking a look at a fantasy series that had a different paradigm than just high medieval European. I enjoyed that. I love that paradigm. I will always be drawn into that type of fantasy book, but I thought this was an excellent job at giving me a different type of paradigm, and I'm here for it. I really enjoyed it, and I certainly would recommend this to anyone that is looking for a new fantasy series, especially something that's a little different, but it's still very fantasy. It still has all the things that you might love, whether it comes to battles, whether it comes to a fascinating magic system. It's all there. That is why this made my list of the top 5 fiction books that I read in 2024. Now looking at the nonfiction list. Again, these are not necessarily books that came out in the year 2024. These are just books that I read in the year 2024. And as usual, I try not to choose particularly well-known classics. I think that those tend to be in their own categories, such as I said with Shakespeare and the fiction choices. But let me give you my top 5, again, in no particular order. Starting out my list would be The Lost Subways of North America. This came out in 2023, and it is by Jake Berman. And I really enjoyed reading this book for a lot of reasons. First of all, it is a book that is designed to tell you a little bit about the infrastructure of not just America, but a lot of different cities, and it takes a look at a lot of the different things that cause our infrastructure to be the way that it is, especially what kinds of forces, be that political forces, social forces, anything that can have an impact in how exactly we decide to design and build our cities. And I found this absolutely fascinating. I find mass transit to inherently be interesting, but I also thought that this did an excellent job at taking all those other things into consideration and demonstrating how that has affected the growth of America. And I really enjoyed this book. Next on my list is Oscar Wars by Michael Schulman. This also came out in 2023. I think I heard about this from NPR Pop Culture Happy Hour, where they named a couple of different books. I tried to read and listen to as many of them as I could, and I really enjoyed this one. Again, it is designed to tell you something very specific, similar to The Lost Subways of North America. It's looking at particular things of interest, but it is just giving you a history of something that I found to be just absolutely fascinating, very engaging, and a way to consider how larger movements are having their impacts on something smaller like art and the creation of films, and just how exactly those have played out over the years, and some of the more controversial moments at the Oscars. Anyways, I just thought it was a really interesting read. I personally love the Oscars, and looking at all the Best Picture and Best Actor and Best Actress nominees, and so I found this to be something that was really engaging, something that, as someone who has tried to watch every Best Picture winner since the beginning of the Oscars, I found this to be a very fascinating look at that process over time. And again, it's a great way to look at the history of America and to take a look at exactly how that is playing out in one particular field. And so I really enjoyed it for that reason. Now, turning to a little farther back, this was actually a book that I spent much of the year reading, and that would be The Power Broker by Robert Caro. I've reviewed one other book of his this year. I did this in conjunction with the 99% Invisible podcast, because they also did a reading of this book this year and had excellent podcasts that reviewed the book, and then they also brought on some interesting guests, and it was just an absolutely fascinating read. It was a look again at somebody who I knew nothing about, and the book did a fantastic job at helping me understand why I should care about this individual, the impact that he had on a city, and his legacy, and just so much more that I had not really even considered about New York. And I really enjoyed this book, even though it is a colossal book, but it certainly helped that I had the team at 99PI really give me more information and more context, and bringing in all those guests really made this all the more interesting. And so I thoroughly recommend both of these books, even though this one came out in 1974, so it is significantly older than most of the other books on my list. Again, another history book, A History of the World in Six Glasses, came out in 2005 by Tom Standage. I believe I read an updated version of it, but I couldn't find exactly what year the second edition was, so I needed to sort that out. But this is, again, another interesting way to look at history. Unlike the other books that I've talked about, where I think they are specifically looking at a very small thing and you can discuss how history played an impact on that small thing, this is the other way around. This is looking at a small thing and showing how it has had a big impact on history, broadly speaking. And I just thought it was a great way to look at history. Again, I think these are really interesting ways to help people become more engaged with history and to consider it in different ways. I don't know if I agreed with everything in this book. There were certainly a few elements of it that I thought, I don't know if that is quite as influential as he insisted that it was, but regardless, it was a very well-researched book. It certainly had a lot to say in terms of large economic forces and the development of political, economic, cultural, and social systems throughout the world, and how that was played out through the look at these 6 different beverages. And so I thought that that was just a fascinating way to explore the world, and I thought he did this well. I've read other books that try to take a look at the world from similar approaches. One that I read not too long ago was The History of Salt. I didn't like that one quite as much as this one, and then I've seen a few others where they try to look at the history of the world through precious metals or things like that, and I can find them engaging, but I found this probably be the most interesting of that style of book that I've read so far. And then last but not least on my list is the same book that I chose for the best Pulitzer Prize finalist and winner, and that would be King: A Life by Jonathan Eig, which came out in 2023. It was one of my absolute favorite books that I read this year. I don't always love all the Pulitzer Prize finalists and winners, and that was true with this last year, but there's almost always a few that I do thoroughly enjoy, and this is certainly one of those. I think that Martin Luther King Jr. is always somebody that is worth learning a little bit more about, but I found it all the more interesting that this individual had access to more up-to-date information, and I felt like he handled the topic of an individual like Martin Luther King Jr. with great tact and great depth, and so he did talk about some of the more controversial elements, but he also made sure to discuss just how difficult and how challenging the world of Martin Luther King Jr. was, and so what it was that he was fighting for. And so I found this an absolutely fascinating read, and again, I would encourage this to almost anybody. And those are my top 10 books of the year 2024, at least the ones that I read. Most of them, or a significant portion of them, close to half of them I think, came out in the year 2023, so they're not too old, but then I do have a fair amount of range there. I am very much looking forward to the year 2025, and I will certainly be discussing not just more books, but ways that things might look a little different in the year 2025 for me in this channel. But of course, stay tuned for that video. If you have any thoughts on my picks for the best books that I read in the year 2024, which obviously these are subject to the books that I read, but hey, please let me know your thoughts anyways. But don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.